78 years old. A pacemaker lies quietly beneath the skin that once stretched taut like steel on his chest. 4 open heart surgeries. Long scars run along his rib cage, not cinematic battle wounds, but real marks from scalpels and endless nights in intensive care. The man who once embodied a heartless machine on the big screen now relies on a tiny device to keep his heartbeat from straying off the fragile orbit of life. It's hard to believe this is Arnold Schwarzenegger, the greatest bodybuilding icon in history, 7-time Mr. Olympia, 5-time Mr. Universe, the man who turned his physique into the global standard of strength and discipline. He starred in the Terminator, Predator, Total Recall, True Lies, films that catapulted his name to the pinnacle of Hollywood and grossed over $8 billion at the worldwide box office. He was an immigrant from a small village in Austria, who arrived in America with a dream bigger than himself and became governor of California, leading the nation's most populous state for 2 terms. He is the embodiment of the American dream, the man who built an empire from nothing, and then that body began to betray him. A congenital heart valve defect he'd carried since birth waited silently for decades before forcing him into valve replacement surgery in 1997. 20 years later, in 2018, a complication required emergency open heart surgery. In 2020, another intervention, and in his 70s, a pacemaker was implanted in his chest, a reminder that even the Terminator has limits. The body once called the most perfect in the world now requires blood pressure checks every morning. The man who once lifted hundreds of pounds now listens to each heartbeat with the caution of someone who knows life is no longer a given. Alongside the victories were mistakes and scandals that fractured his family and damaged his reputation. But what makes this story not just tragedy, but strength, is this: he never ran from it. He admitted it, took responsibility, and kept getting back up. So what really happened to Arnold Schwarzenegger at age 78? Is it the decline of a legend, or the final proof that greatness isn't about never falling, it's about still standing up, even when your heart needs machines to keep beating? If the story of this machine with a scarred heart moves you, hit subscribe to the channel right now, so you don't miss the journey behind Arnold Schwarzenegger's victories and wounds. Behind the scars on the chest of that 78-year-old man is a boy who grew up amid the ruins of post-war Austria. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger was born in 1947 in the small village of Thal, near Graz, when Europe was still recovering from World War II. His family home wasn't spacious, wasn't warm, and certainly wasn't filled with words of love. The walls were cold in winter, no refrigerator until Arnold reached his teens. Every penny had to be counted. But what made young Arnold feel colder than any European winter wasn't poverty, it was the silence. His father, Gustav Schwarzenegger, was a local police officer who had served in the German army during the war. He was a man of discipline, orders and unrelenting hardness. In that small house in Thal, military discipline didn't stop at the barracks door. It entered the living room, the dining table, even the gaze directed at his 2 sons. Arnold and his brother Meinhard grew up under rules so strict they bordered on harsh. Beds had to be perfectly made, breakfast at exact times, no talking back, no weakness, no crying. Arnold later recalled that his father rarely showed affection. No hugs, no praise, no words every child craves to hear, "I'm proud of you." Instead there were comparisons. Meinhard was seen as the better-behaved son, fitting the mold his father wanted. Arnold was different. That boy had too much energy, too much stubbornness, too much hunger to break free from the limits of a small village. And every time Arnold fell short, he heard disappointment more than encouragement. There were winter mornings, when the brothers had to run in the snow before school, as a test of will. There were times his father exploded in anger over tiny mistakes. Arnold learned very early to bury emotions deep inside. That boy understood crying wouldn't make things better. Weakness would only deepen his father's disappointment. So Arnold tensed up, tensed to keep from trembling, tensed to hold back tears, tensed to prove he was strong enough. But beneath that hard shell was a child's heart longing to be seen. The silence in that house became the most powerful hidden engine of his life. If his father wouldn't say he was proud, Arnold would make the whole world say it. If this village was too small, he would find a bigger place. If love didn't come naturally, he would seize recognition through victory. The first tragedy struck when Arnold was just over 20. In 1971, his brother Meinhard died in a car accident while driving drunk. The news reached him while he was in America pursuing bodybuilding. He didn't return for the funeral. A year later, in 1972, his father died of a stroke. Once again, Arnold didn't go back to Austria. That decision followed him his whole life, like a long shadow. Some called it coldness, but deep down, it was a tearing conflict between ambition and the past. Arnold later admitted he didn't know how to face his emotions. The losses came too fast, too brutally. And instead of stopping to grieve, he charged forward, training, competing, building a future, as if pausing for even a second would let all the pain crash in. That guilt never fully disappeared. The man who conquered Mr. Olympia, dominated Hollywood, and became governor of California still carried the memory of the boy who never heard praise from his father, of the brother who never got to say goodbye. There were victories so huge the world cheered, but they couldn't turn back time to hear one simple sentence: "You did good, son." The dominant emotion of those early years wasn't glory. It was a boy straining not to cry, a boy learning to turn hurt into fuel, a boy realizing that to be seen, he had to become extraordinary. And it was in the icy silence of that small house in Thal that the seed of ambition was planted, not with encouragement, but with its absence. It was in the cold stillness of the Thal house, where a boy learned to swallow his tears, that Arnold found something to replace the praise he never received: muscle. At first, bodybuilding was just an image in a magazine, a photo of Reg Park, a man whose physique looked carved from marble, standing in the light and admired by the world. But to 15-year-old Arnold, it wasn't just an athlete, it was an escape. Bodybuilding wasn't just a dream, it was a way to escape the feeling of not being good enough. In that tiny gym, the smell of metal and sweat replaced the heavy silence at home. The barbell didn't judge. It didn't compare Arnold to anyone else. It only demanded one thing: effort. And every time he lifted heavier than yesterday, every time he saw his muscles stand out more sharply under his skin, that boy felt like he could control something in a world full of uncertainty. Arnold trained with an almost obsessive intensity, 6 days a week, then 7 hours on end in front of the mirror, not out of vanity, but searching for proof that he was changing. He didn't just want to be stronger, he wanted to be the strongest. He wanted his body to grow so massive that no one could ignore it. He wanted every eye in a room to stop when he walked in. But obsession always has two sides. It was both fuel and a quiet blade cutting deep into his soul. Arnold began viewing life through the lens of victory. Rankings weren't just positions on a scoreboard. They were the measure of a man's worth. If he didn't win, it meant he wasn't good enough. If he wasn't good enough, it meant his father had been right to be disappointed. At 18, Arnold entered mandatory military service in Austria. But the army didn't slow him down. If anything, it strengthened his resolve to break out of those narrow boundaries. When he heard about a bodybuilding contest during his service, Arnold made a bold decision. He snuck out of the barracks to compete. It wasn't just the impulsive act of a young man. It was a declaration that his dream was bigger than any order. Arnold won that contest, but when he returned to the barracks, he faced military discipline, confinement, reprimands. For many that would have been a lesson to quit, but for Arnold the punishment only proved he was willing to pay the price for his dream. He later said that the moment he stood on stage receiving the trophy, he knew he would never go back to his old life. The military punishment didn't make him regret it. The only thing he feared was never trying. Training to exhaustion became routine. Aching muscles, torn calluses, trembling limbs, all just necessary steps. He didn't see pain. He saw opportunity. Every drop of sweat was a step farther from the boy who once felt invisible. Every competition was a chance to hear what his father never said. But deep down, the question lingered quietly: was this passion or escape? Did Arnold truly love bodybuilding, or did he love the feeling of winning because it filled the emptiness in his heart? Maybe both. Maybe bodybuilding started as a shield, then slowly became his identity. The boy who once tensed up to keep from crying, now tensed under hundreds of pounds of iron. Instead of tears, there was sweat. Instead of praise, there was the roar of the crowd. And every time the audience cheered, Arnold felt seen, recognized, existent. Bodybuilding didn't heal his childhood. It didn't erase his father's silence, bring his brother back, or soothe the guilt that haunted him. But it gave Arnold something he'd never had: control over his destiny. In a world that once made the boy feel small, the gym became the place where he felt bigger than his fears. And right there, amid the clanging metal and dim lights of those old-school gyms, Arnold began building not just a body, but a personality. A personality ready to endure pain, ready to take risks, ready to sacrifice to become someone no one could overlook. The boy seeking recognition through muscle unwittingly created a machine of will, a man who wouldn't stop until the whole world had to say, "We see you." It was from that metal-scented training room that Arnold's journey stopped being a vague dream. It became a calculated plan. Step by step, he left Austria, set foot in America with a small suitcase and colossal ambition. In California, under the golden sun of Venice Beach and the sound of weights clashing at Gold's Gym, Arnold didn't just train, he dominated. His body grew at a pace that stunned even veteran athletes. Shoulders wide as a wall, chest like a shield, arms round and full like carved marble. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to win indisputably. In 1970, Arnold claimed his first Mr. Olympia title, then the second, the third, a total of 7 times, from 1970 to 1975, and one more in 1980, 7 crowns, 7 times standing at the absolute peak of world bodybuilding. The media called him the Austrian Oak. The fans called him a living legend. He became the face of a new era of muscle, bigger, sharper, more confident. But victory never came for free. That was the era when bodybuilding entered a brutal phase, the steroid era. Athletes no longer competed just on genetics and training, they competed with controversial enhancements. Arnold later admitted he used steroids at a time when they weren't banned and were considered part of the competitive landscape. He didn't dodge the truth, but that truth also showed how ruthless the race he entered really was. To stay number one, he had to accept the risks. He had to push his body to limits most people wouldn't dare touch. Arnold's training wasn't just heavy, it was near extreme. 2 sessions a day, each lasting hours, muscles torn down, rebuilt, torn down again. He believed pain was a sign of progress. If it didn't hurt, it wasn't heavy enough. If he wasn't exhausted, he wasn't trying hard enough. In his 20s, his body responded like a perfect machine, but the damage didn't disappear, it accumulated. Joints began taking excessive strain, shoulders stiffened, knees wore down after thousands of heavy squats, lower back bore the load from deadlifts beyond the threshold. When he was young, he didn't think about long-term consequences. He only thought about the next stage, the next title, the next spotlight. But every tiny crack in those joints was a bill his body would collect decades later. Amid those glorious victories, Arnold lived far from his homeland, far from family, far from his native language. He spoke English with a thick accent that often drew mockery. He learned to mask his sense of displacement with near-defiant confidence. On the outside, he was a man walking with squared shoulders and a victorious smile. On the inside, he was still the boy from Thal trying to prove he deserved to be seen. Venice Beach had sunshine and laughter, but also long, lonely nights. No brother anymore, no strict father, no old house, just him and his dream. Many people looked at Arnold at that time and saw an icon of strength, but that strength was also a shield. He rarely talked about homesickness, rarely admitted that sometimes he felt like an outsider in the land of promise. Winning on stage didn't heal his childhood. Each Mr. Olympia title didn't bring the words he had once craved to hear from his father. When the crowd chanted his name, when cameras flashed non-stop, perhaps deep down Arnold still wondered, am I good enough now? Would that father be proud now? Success didn't erase the emptiness, it only covered it with applause. Arnold built a physique the whole world admired, but the emotional voids from childhood remained. He defeated every opponent on stage, but he couldn't go back to change those cold mornings in Thal. He became the strongest man on the planet, but that strength couldn't bring the gentleness he had once lacked. And then after 7 crowns, Arnold started looking farther. Bodybuilding gave him recognition, but he didn't want to be just a muscled athlete. He wanted more. He wanted movies. He wanted influence. He wanted power. His body had helped him win everything in the small world of the gym, but in his heart he knew the bigger battle was still ahead. The body that won everything, the body that won it all on the bodybuilding stage. But that victory was only the first step. It proved that the boy who once felt not good enough could become the best in the world. It proved that willpower could bend biological limits, but it also left quiet cracks, injuries that would follow him for life. And more importantly, it showed a bitter truth. No matter how many titles he won, the past doesn't automatically heal. Arnold left the Mr. Olympia stage, not because he lost passion, but because he knew there was another mountain to conquer. But before moving to the next chapter, one thing was undeniable: that body had helped him win everything, except peace in his heart. But if bodybuilding was where Arnold was crowned a king, Hollywood was where he was pulled back to the position of an outsider. When he left the Mr. Olympia stage to step into the film industry, he brought a perfect physique and a fierce belief that he could conquer another peak. But this time, muscle wasn't enough. The first auditions had no glory at all. They were cold and full of skeptical stares. He walked into casting rooms with the confidence of a world champion, but when he spoke, the silence in the room carried a different color from the cheers of bodybuilding crowds. His Austrian accent was thick and heavy. Producers whispered, "No one can understand what he's saying." Some were blunter, "Your name is too long. No one can pronounce Schwarzenegger." Some even suggested he change his name to something easier on American eaters, and another comment, no less painful, "Your muscles have no emotion." In their eyes, Arnold wasn't an actor. In their eyes, Arnold wasn't an actor. He was a walking block of muscle, a physical icon, but not an artist. They looked at that massive frame and didn't see depth. They looked at that chiseled face and thought it couldn't convey pain or vulnerability. Arnold was nearly 30 then. In Hollywood, that was no longer the age for new discoveries. Younger, more flexible actors who spoke fluent English were crowding into every role. He was used to winning, used to stepping on stage and being handed a crown. But in audition rooms, he became the one waiting, hoping someone would see the potential behind the accent and the muscles. The first small roles brought no breakthrough. The movie Hercules in New York in 1970 even had his lines dubbed because his accent was too hard to understand. Audiences laughed, critics mocked. At times Arnold was labeled a muscle joke. Posters weren't enough to hide the fact that Hollywood wasn't ready to accept an action star with a strange voice and a name too long to fit on billboards. There were nights he wondered if he had made a mistake. Bodybuilding had brought him fame and money. Why push himself into a new field full of risks? But Arnold wasn't raised to back down. The boy who once tensed to keep from crying now tensed in front of the skeptical eyes of the world's harshest industry. Conan came at almost the last moment. The Conan the Barbarian project wasn't a film every actor dreamed of. It was a gamble, rough script, savage setting. But for Arnold, it was a chance. Maybe the last chance to prove he wasn't just muscle, but a cinematic presence. He trained not just for his physique, but for every movement, every look. He learned to speak slower, clearer, turning the accent into part of his character instead of a weakness. Before Conan premiered, many in the industry still doubted. They didn't believe a man with a hard-to-read name and a distinctive voice could lead a big film. But when the theater lights came up, audiences saw what those earlier auditions hadn't. Arnold didn't need to talk much to create magnetism. His silence had weight. His body wasn't just muscle, it was a symbol of primal power. Even so, even after Conan's success, the road ahead wasn't smooth. He still had to prove himself worthy of every next role. Hollywood didn't forget first impressions quickly. But those years of being mocked forged Arnold once again. From the boy compared to his brother, to the champion doubted for his origins, and now the actor seen as not emotional enough, he faced the same old message, not good enough yet. The dominant emotion of this period wasn't glory. It was quiet humiliation. It was the moment a man nearing 30, who had once stood at the top of the bodybuilding world, still had to hear dismissals like a rookie. It was the stubbornness of someone who refused to return to Austria in defeat. It was the determination to turn what was seen as a weakness into his own signature. Arnold once said he always believed he would become a big movie star. That belief sounded arrogant to many. But without that belief, he couldn't have endured the laughter, the rejections, the cold head shakes. Hollywood tried to make him feel small, but Arnold had lived his entire childhood with that feeling, and he knew how to turn it into fuel. Conan wasn't just a role, it was the first real comeback. It was proof that the man once told "no one can understand what you're saying" could make the whole world listen. But before the line "I'll be back" echoed and became immortal, Arnold had to go through a long, painful period of humility, a phase where every past victory seemed worthless, and he had to start over from scratch, proving once again that he was good enough. Conan opened the door, but it was a steel monster that made Arnold immortal. In 1984, when the Terminator hit theaters, no one could have predicted that this modest-budget sci-fi film would completely change his place in movie history. The role of the T-800, a killing machine from the future, seemed tailor-made for him: minimal dialogue, icy stare, heavy stride, and overwhelming presence. And then that line came, short, rough, almost mechanical: "I'll be back." No one knew those 3 words would become one of the most famous lines of all time, parodied, quoted, plastered on posters, and etched into pop culture. The film succeeded far beyond expectations. Arnold was no longer the doubted muscle actor, he became an icon. His face was everywhere. Producers started writing scripts around his physique and aura. Predator, Commando, Total Recall, True Lies, each film reinforced the image of a man who was nearly indestructible. Hollywood finally accepted his accent. It even became a brand. The name Schwarzenegger was no longer a burden, it was box office gold. But behind the flashbulbs and giant posters was a brutal lifestyle: packed shooting schedules, months of constant travel from one set to another. Every role demanded he keep his physique at an almost unreal level. In his 30s and 40s, when many actors started easing off training, Arnold still had to train like a professional competitor. Mornings in the gym, afternoons on set, evenings in meetings with directors or producers. His body wasn't allowed to slack even a little, because audiences had grown used to seeing a perfect machine. The pressure to maintain his physique never left him. If he gained weight, the press would scrutinize. If he looked tired, the media would question. He didn't just have to act, he had to sustain the illusion of invincibility. Every bicep, every ab, every line on his face was under a microscope. There were days he had to train even when his body ached from action scene injuries. For Arnold, failing to meet the standard audiences expected hurt more than any physical wound. While the world saw a superhero, his personal life slowly shrank. Rare quiet dinners, conversations interrupted by work calls, vacations scheduled around shooting dates. He once said success brings many opportunities, but also takes away privacy. At his peak, Arnold couldn't walk into a restaurant without being recognized. He had become public property. The loneliness amid the spotlight was something few saw. When the applause died, when the film crew left the set, when the hotel grew quiet at midnight, he was left with just himself. The boy from Thal who once wanted the whole world to see him now had that. But the price was having nowhere to hide. No space left just for Arnold the person, only for Arnold the icon. The success of the Terminator also created an image he could hardly escape. He was typecast as the action hero. Roles requiring emotional depth rarely came his way. Hollywood had accepted him, but on their terms. He was the machine, the warrior, the muscle icon. Few wanted to see him as a vulnerable or fragile man. Yet the very role of that monster reflected a bitter truth. On screen, the T-800 had no heart. In real life, Arnold did, and that heart had to endure an unforgiving pace. He worked relentlessly, as if slowing down would make everything collapse. As if the boy once told he wasn't good enough was still pushing the grown man to prove it again. Arnold had achieved what few dared dream: from a small village in Austria to a global icon. But amid those dazzling successes, he was still a man trying to balance ambition and exhaustion, fame and personal life, the image of an unbreakable machine, and the reality that he was still human. The monster that made him immortal wasn't just about the role that took him to the top. It was about how a fictional character turned him into a legend, but also locked him into a rigid mold. From then on, Arnold wasn't just an actor, he was the symbol of tireless strength. And that very symbol forced him to keep running, keep lifting, keep fighting, even when inside, sometimes he just wanted to stop and breathe. When Hollywood's lights shone brightest, Arnold stepped into a chapter the public believed he had finally found balance in love and family. In 1986, he married Maria Shriver, a smart, composed journalist and member of the famous Kennedy family. That marriage wasn't just a romance between an action star and a talented woman. It was the intersection of two worlds of power, Hollywood and American politics. To many, it was proof that the boy from the small Austrian village had not only conquered the gym and the screen, but had also stepped into the heart of powerful America. Images of them together at major events, hand in hand among political and cinematic icons, created an almost perfect story. Arnold, the most successful immigrant in Hollywood. Maria, the woman carrying the Kennedy legacy. They had beautiful children, lived in grand California homes. On magazine covers, they were the ideal family. In the public eye, this was the complete American dream. Success, love, prestige. But behind those perfect pictures was pressure no one saw. The Kennedy name wasn't just a surname. It was a legacy, a responsibility. When Arnold married Maria, he didn't just become her husband. He became part of a family tied to America's political history. Every statement, every action of his was no longer purely personal. It could reflect on the entire lineage. Meanwhile, Arnold's career didn't slow down. He kept taking roles, kept producing films, kept building his brand. Long days on set followed by transcontinental flights. Family evenings were sometimes replaced by meetings, promotional events, new projects. Arnold was used to that pace. He lived on ambition. But for Maria, who valued presence and connection, the distance began to grow quietly. Political pressure also crept into their home. When Arnold decided to run for governor of California in 23, their family stepped onto a new stage, harsher and less forgiving than Hollywood. The media dug into his past. Questions about his political positions, past behavior, his strong personality were scrutinized in every detail. Maria, an independent journalist, had to pause her career to avoid conflicts of interest. That sacrifice was rarely mentioned, but it left its mark on their relationship. Arnold won the election. He became governor of California. To the world it was a miracle, an immigrant with a heavy accent leading the most populous state in America. But inside the family, the pace grew even more tense. Politics wasn't like movies. There were no controlled scripts, no retakes. Every decision sparked controversy. Every day was a battle. While the public saw a strong family standing together on podiums, small cracks began to appear, not through loud arguments, but through silence, through quieter dinners, through separate trips. Arnold, accustomed to pushing forward, despite any obstacle, perhaps didn't realize that while he conquered new peaks, the gap between him and Maria was silently widening. The distance didn't happen overnight. It built up over years, through the times he prioritized work, through unspoken expectations, through the pressure to maintain a perfect public image. Their family was seen as a symbol of success and virtue, but symbols can sometimes weigh heavier than reality. When you always have to appear strong, always united, space to show vulnerability becomes rare. Arnold once said he always believed he could handle many things at once: career, politics, family. But that belief also reflected his lifelong habit, believing willpower could make up for any shortfall. In the gym, it worked. In movies, it was effective. But in marriage, willpower can't replace presence. Success can't replace listening. The perfect family that isn't a story of deception. They loved each other. They built a real family. But between ambition and responsibility, between the spotlight and private life, the cracks gradually spread. And while the world kept seeing a perfect picture, inside, the foundation had begun to shake quietly, but irreversibly. As the cracks in the family began to spread silently, Arnold stepped onto a stage even bigger than Hollywood. In 23, Amid California's severe budget crisis, he announced his run for governor in the shocking recall election. The media called him the governator. To many, it was just another performance by the action star, but for Arnold, it was the logical next step in his lifelong ambition, from the gym to the screen, and now to political power. His victory wasn't just personal, it was a symbol of America, where a boy immigrant from Austria, speaking English with a heavy accent, could become the leader of the state's largest population and biggest economy. He stood on the inauguration podium, hand raised high, with his familiar smile, talking about reform, responsibility, the future. To many, it was a historic moment. To Arnold, it was a promise. He would prove he was more than muscle and movies. But politics isn't like the gym. It doesn't follow simple rules of effort and results. California was then drowning in a budget deficit of tens of billions of dollars, a chaotic energy system, fiercely opposing interest groups. Every decision he made was examined, analyzed, attacked. The media no longer just photographed him in sharp suits. They dug into his past, old statements, every rumor that had ever surfaced. Media pressure became heavier than ever. Sensational headlines appeared weekly. Accusations about past behavior were repeated, amplified. Political opponents didn't hesitate to use every misstep, every imprecise statement to attack. Arnold, used to controlling his image on screen, now faced an environment where he couldn't rewrite the script. The early years of his term were a string of tense days. He pushed financial reforms, tried to cut the deficit, signed pioneering environmental laws to limit greenhouse gas emissions. But every reform met opposition from both political sides. Sometimes his approval ratings dropped sharply. Sometimes he was criticized for being too soft. Sometimes accused of being too hardline. Politics taught him a new lesson: you can't please everyone. Meanwhile, outside meeting rooms and podiums, his family continued to bear the pressure. Maria, once an independent journalist, had to live in the role of First Lady of California. Her career was set aside to avoid conflicts of interest. Every public event demanded a perfect smile. Every evening could be interrupted by an urgent call from the governor's office. Arnold often said he could separate work and family. But reality was harsher. Long work days, overnight meetings, constant business trips made family time scarcer. He was used to Hollywood's busy pace, but politics was even more brutal. No cut to rest. No script to predict ahead. Political attacks weren't just in the press. They were prolonged psychological pressure. Every statement had to be weighed. Every decision could trigger a chain reaction. Arnold, accustomed to using strength and decisiveness to solve problems, now had to learn negotiation, compromise, even admitting mistakes in public. And while he tried to run a massive state, whose economy ranked fifth in the world if compared to independent nations, his personal life gradually slipped out of control. The distances that had already formed in the marriage became more evident. When the cameras turned off, when the office door closed, family conversations no longer came as easily as before. Arnold once was a man who believed willpower could overcome anything. He proved it in bodybuilding, in movies. But now, amid budget meetings and policy debates, he had to face a painful truth: leading a state didn't mean he could control his personal life. The governor who couldn't govern his own life isn't a denial of his political achievements. He signed laws with lasting impact, shaped environmental policy, and became one of the most widely recognized governors in America. But at the same time, it was the period when the balance between ambition and family was more fragile than ever. The immigrant who once craved recognition now held more power than most people dream of. But power couldn't automatically heal the distances quietly growing in his own home. And while he stood in the eye of the political storm, trying to steer a state in crisis, perhaps he didn't realize that another storm, more private, more painful, was slowly forming behind the family door. That storm didn't arrive with thunder. It came with a question, a doubt, a truth that could no longer be hidden. In 2011, right after Arnold left the office of Governor of California, his world collapsed, not because of a wrong political decision, not because of an economic failure, but because of a personal secret that had lasted more than a decade. He had a child out of wedlock with the family's longtime housekeeper, Mildred Bettina. The boy Joseph was born in 1997. Ironically, Joseph was only a few days older than Arnold's youngest child with Maria. The two boys grew up in the same house, around the same time, but carrying two completely different truths. At first, Arnold didn't publicly acknowledge it, but time wasn't on his side. The resemblances grew clearer. The face, the walk, the eyes. And then one day, Maria confronted him with the truth she had begun to suspect. The moment Maria found out, there were no screams, no dramatic scene like in the movies, just silence, thick, prolonged silence. The woman who had stood by him for 25 years, who had sacrificed her career to support his political ambition, now stood before an irreversible betrayal. Arnold later said he confessed when asked directly. No more denial, no more evasion. He looked into Maria's eyes and told the truth. Perhaps in that moment, he understood that no amount of physical strength, no political power, no Hollywood fame could shield him from the consequences of his own actions. The scene of him telling the children was even more painful. 4 children. Kids who had grown up with the image of a strong, disciplined, successful father. Now they had to hear that he had lived a double life. He later said it was the hardest conversation of his life. There was no way to make it easier, no excuse strong enough to erase the hurt. In the house that once rang with laughter and children's footsteps, silence took over. Family meals became heavy. Eyes avoided each other. No one needed to shout to understand that everything had changed forever. After 25 years of marriage, Maria filed for divorce. The legal separation dragged on for years, but emotionally, it ended the moment the truth was admitted. The Kennedy family, long a symbol of honor and public responsibility, couldn't help but react. The support once given to Arnold gradually faded. He hadn't just hurt his wife and children, he had hurt an entire legacy. The media didn't miss the chance. Headlines appeared everywhere. Governator's secret son. Family betrayal. End of a political dynasty dream. The image of the man who once stood on podiums with a confident smile was replaced by one with his head bowed before cameras. This wasn't an on-set accident. It wasn't an unplanned heart surgery. This was a choice. A moral mistake. And its price couldn't be paid with money or fame. Arnold had once plunged into the sea in a runaway truck while filming The Expendables. He survived thanks to his diving skills. But in 2011, he fell into a different abyss, one no skill could immediately save him from. This was Arnold's Black Sea accident. But this time it wasn't his body at risk. It was his honor. He publicly apologized. He took responsibility. He blamed no one else. In a later interview, he said, "This was my biggest failure. Not failure in the gym. Not failure at the box office. Not political failure. The biggest failure was with his family." That statement didn't erase the pain, but it showed a shift. For the first time in his life, Arnold didn't try to prove he was stronger. He admitted he had been wrong. Joseph, the boy born from that secret, grew up under the public eye. Arnold gradually acknowledged him openly and built a relationship with his son. They trained together, lifted weights together, took photos together. There was a gentleness in those moments, as if Arnold was trying to do the right thing, even if it was too late. But healing didn't erase the initial breakage. His reputation changed. From the perfect symbol of the American dream, he became an example of the fall that comes with power and ambition. In the house that was once the ideal model, wholeness was gone. Holidays weren't the same. Gatherings no longer felt complete. And Arnold, who once believed willpower could fix anything, had to learn a different lesson. Some wounds can't fully heal. This collapse was different from every previous failure in his life. When he was mocked for his accent, he could train his voice. When he lost a competition, he could train harder. When California faced a budget crisis, he could negotiate. But when his family broke because of his own decision, there was no gym to fix it, no director to call, cut and redo. The secret that destroyed everything isn't just the story of a secret exposed. It is the moment Arnold was forced to confront his weakest part, not the biological heart that needed surgery, but the moral heart that needed honesty. The man who once built his career on the image of an emotionless machine now had to admit that he was human, with mistakes, with desires, with wrong decisions. And that very admission, though it couldn't salvage the past, became the first step of a different journey. the journey of living with the consequences and trying to become better. 2011 didn't kill Arnold Schwarzenegger, but it shattered the image he had spent decades building. And in the ruins of his honor, he had to decide, would he run away or would he stand and take responsibility. This time, there was no confident "I'll be back" ringing out. Just a middle-aged man standing in the silence of his family, understanding that the deepest wound in his life wasn't caused by anyone else, it was caused by himself. After 2011, with his honor damaged and his family broken, Arnold had to face another truth, not one born from a moral mistake, but from his own body. If the scandal was the Black Sea accident of his honor, then his heart was a reminder that even the strongest have weaknesses from birth. Arnold Schwarzenegger was born with a congenital heart valve defect, an aortic valve with 2 leaflets instead of the normal 3. For many years, he didn't talk much about it. When he was young, his body was too strong for symptoms to become serious. He lifted hundreds of pounds, ran, swam, filmed high-intensity action movies. The public saw muscle. They didn't see the different heart structure quietly working overtime. In 1997, at age 50, he was forced into his first heart valve replacement surgery. It wasn't an easy decision. For someone who had built an image of invincibility, admitting he needed heart surgery felt like admitting vulnerability to the world. But the doctors were clear: without replacing the valve, the risk of life-threatening complications couldn't be ignored. He walked into the operating room, not in the Terminator's leather jacket, but in a thin hospital gown. No director, no stage lights. Just the cold white light of the operating room, and the steady sound of medical machines. The man who once played a heartless machine, now lay there, chest opened, so doctors could repair his real heart. The surgery was successful. Arnold recovered and returned to work. He went back to training. He kept making movies. The public saw that comeback as proof of his iron will, but the truth was his heart was no longer the same. The artificial valve worked well, but his body had entered a new chapter, one where age and time could no longer be ignored. 21 years later, in 2018, a complication arose during a less invasive valve replacement procedure. What should have been a relatively safe process turned into an emergency open heart surgery that lasted many hours. Arnold later recounted waking up in a haze, hearing the doctors say they had to open his chest because of the complication. There was a moment when his family and medical team weren't sure he would recover easily. A 70-year-old body doesn't respond like a 50-year-old one. No more youthful elasticity. No more quick self-repair. The man who once played an immortal warrior now faced the reality that a weak heart could end it all. Arnold said that when he woke up, the first thing he said was, "I'm back." But this time, the words weren't symbolic. They were relief, proof that he was still alive, an acknowledgement that he had just crossed a fragile boundary. Recovery wasn't easy. He had to relearn how to walk more than a few steps without gasping for breath. He had to accept days when his body wouldn't cooperate. For someone who had always prided himself on physical strength, feeling weak was a bigger psychological challenge than the pain itself. In 2020, he went through another valve replacement, not because he was careless, but because biology doesn't care about fame. And by 2024, he publicly revealed that he had a pacemaker implanted to regulate his irregular heartbeat. A tiny device, hidden beneath the skin that magazines once called the most perfect physique in the world, now took on the job of sustaining life. How ironic. The man who once embodied a heartless robot now depended on technology to keep his real heart beating. Perhaps the most painful moment wasn't when his chest was opened. It was when he realized that strength couldn't protect him from biology, couldn't negotiate with age, couldn't force his heart to work through sheer will. The strongest man in the world, weakest on the operating table. In the operating room, he wasn't a governor, he wasn't a movie star, he wasn't Mr. Olympia. He was just a patient, a human being completely dependent on the doctor's skill and the machine's precision. No muscle helped him breathe on his own, under anesthesia. No title made his heart beat steadier. And perhaps right there, amid the beeps of the heart monitor and the cold light of the recovery room, Arnold learned another lesson in humility. He had overcome poverty, overcome mockery, overcome scandal. But this time he had to overcome his own biological limits. After each surgery, he returned to the gym, not to build gigantic muscles like in his youth, but to maintain life, not to win titles, but to prove that repaired heart still had value. The heart that betrayed him isn't a story of true betrayal. His heart didn't intentionally weaken him. It only reminded him that he was human, and in that fragility, there was a truth deeper than any victory. Real strength isn't about never falling, it's about accepting that you can fall and still choosing to stand up. Arnold once said that every morning he wakes up feeling grateful to be alive. For a man who once chased glory without pause, that gratitude was a big change. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. That heart which had been operated on multiple times still beat, not perfectly, not naturally like before, but enough to continue another chapter of life, where he was no longer an immortal machine, but an aging man learning to slow down, to cherish every heartbeat he once took for granted. After the 2018 surgery, as the anesthesia wore off and the beeps of the heart monitor became a familiar sound in the recovery room, Arnold was no longer Hollywood's steel icon. He was a man in his 70s who had just survived emergency open-heart surgery, and for the first time in decades, he had to relearn the simplest things: stand up and walk. When he was 30, his body recovered like a perfectly oiled machine. After dangerous action scenes, he could be back in the gym in just a few days. After exhausting training sessions, he only needed one night's sleep to be full of energy again. But in his 70s, biology no longer stood on his side. Every step down the hospital hallway felt like climbing an invisible hill. His chest still ached from the incision, his body was weak from blood loss and anesthesia, his heart beat steadily but no longer with the former power. The nurse asked him to sit up. He tried. Dizziness hit. The world spun for a few seconds. The man who once lifted hundreds of pounds of iron now needed two people to support him for a few steps. It wasn't the physical pain that bothered him most. It was the collision between the image he once had of himself and the reality in front of him. Arnold later said, "I thought I might not make it." That statement wasn't meant to evoke emotion. It was the truth. In those first hours after the emergency surgery, when the doctors had to open his chest to save him, there was a fragile moment when even he could feel the boundary. Not on a movie set, not in a script, but in real life. Recovery began with slow walks along the hospital corridor, a few more steps each day, trying to breathe deeper each day. He who once believed willpower could overcome any limit, now had to accept his body's pace, and his body no longer obeyed the commands of ambition. A body over 70 doesn't recover like one at 30. Muscle is lost faster and returns slower. Wounds take weeks instead of days. Sleep is no longer deep and unbroken. Arnold understood this intellectually, but emotions were another matter. There were nights he lay awake wondering if he could ever get back to how things were, if he still had the strength to train, to appear in public, to continue unfinished projects. For someone who had built his entire life on the image of strength, feeling weak felt like losing part of his identity. But it was in that period that Arnold learned to redefine strength, not lifting heavier weights, not running faster, but being more patient, more humble, accepting limits. He started with simple physical therapy exercises, walking on the treadmill at a slow speed, breathing exercises to expand his lungs, gentle stretches instead of the heavy lifts of the past. Every small progress became a victory. No audience, no medals, just him and the heart rate monitor. His greatest fear wasn't death. It was not being able to return, not being able to continue living the proactive life he had always pursued. Arnold once said the thing he feared most was being trapped, physically or mentally, and in those early weeks of recovery, he had to face that very fear. But if there was one thing he had never done in his life, it was surrender. He set weekly goals: walk an extra 100 steps, add 5 more minutes of activity. Just like when he was young, he turned recovery into a specific plan, not to prove anything to the world, but to prove to himself that the repaired heart could still support a full life. When he finally returned to the gym, the feeling was no longer the same. It was no longer the place where he sought recognition. It was the place where he maintained life. He no longer lifted weights to be bigger than anyone else. he lifted to keep his body functioning, his joints flexible, his heart beating steadily. There was a different silence in this period, not the silence of a broken family, but the silence of acceptance. Arnold began speaking more about gratitude, about cherishing every morning he woke up, about realizing he wasn't an immortal machine. Relearning to walk at 70 wasn't just a physical journey. It was a spiritual one. It was a man accustomed to standing at the peak learning humility before limits. It was understanding that greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it lies in taking slow steps down a hospital hallway, even when the heart still hurts and the legs still tremble. Arnold had lived many lives, athlete, actor, governor, but perhaps the hardest life was that of an old man learning to live with an imperfect heart. And in every step, slower, heavier, there was still the same will that had taken him out of that small Austrian village, never stop. But there was another journey even harder than relearning to walk. That was learning to be a father honestly. After 2011, when the secret was exposed, Joseph Benina was no longer a whispered name behind closed doors. He became a public part of Arnold's life, and facing him not as an iconic image, but with truth, was a deeper challenge than any surgery. Joseph was born in 1997. He grew up almost in Arnold's sight for many years, but in a different context. When the truth was acknowledged, Joseph was still a teenager. He didn't choose his circumstances. He didn't choose to become the center of media attention. He was just a child realizing that the man he admired was also the man who had hidden his existence. The guilt for Arnold was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, eyes, a voice. He once said his greatest responsibility was to protect and support all his children. But with Joseph, the journey started later and was more complicated. It wasn't just building a father-son relationship, it was repairing a truth that had caused hurt from the beginning. Arnold chose not to hide. He publicly acknowledged Joseph as his son. He appeared with him at events. He shared photos of the two of them training together in the gym. Those photos spread across social media, two physiques standing side by side, performing familiar gym movements, muscles flexing under the lights. But behind every photo was a far more complex story. When Arnold watched Joseph lift weights, perhaps he saw his younger self, the boy seeking recognition through muscle. But this time the roles were reversed. He was no longer the one seeking praise from a father. He was the father who had to learn to say the things he had never heard. To say, "I'm proud of you," to be present, to listen. There was pride in his eyes when Joseph developed in bodybuilding, when he pursued his own career in entertainment and real estate. But there was also pain, because every step Joseph took reminded Arnold of how their relationship began. No joyful announcement, no complete family from the start, just a truth that arrived late and efforts to mend it. For Joseph, carrying the Schwarzenegger name was an honor but also a burden. Every success of his could be compared, every failure could be magnified. Arnold understood that, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he didn't want his son to live in his shadow. He wanted Joseph to have the chance to build his own identity, the same chance he had once seized when he left Austria. Facing the son he hid isn't just a story about responsibility, it's a story about belated maturity. Arnold once built his career by charging forward, never looking back. But in his relationship with Joseph, he was forced to look back, to look at the mistake, to look at the consequences, and to accept that love can't erase the past, but it can shape the future. There were gym sessions between father and son with no cameras, no press headlines, just two men lifting weights, talking, sharing. In those moments, Arnold wasn't a governor or a movie star, he was a father trying to do the right thing. And perhaps right there in the gym, where he once sought recognition for himself, he learned the most important lesson: muscle can build strength, but only honesty can build a relationship. The guilt didn't disappear completely, it couldn't, but it became a different kind of fuel, not to win a title, but to become a better father than yesterday. Arnold couldn't change how things started, but he could change how they continued. When people see the two of them standing side by side, many see continuation, they see a mini Arnold. But if you look closer, it's the image of a man who once made a mistake now, trying to atone through actions, not words. And in that journey there was an irony. The man who once hid the truth now chose to make the relationship public. The man who once feared losing his image now placed sincerity first, not because he was perfect, but because he understood that if he wanted his son not to grow up with the same emptiness he had to fill it with presence. Amid the heart surgeries, the scars on his chest, and the recovery workouts, the relationship with Joseph became another part of the healing process, not healing the past, but healing the future. After the efforts to mend, after the gym sessions with Joseph and the public apologies, Arnold's life moved into a quieter phase, and also a lonelier one. The divorce from Maria officially closed a chapter that had lasted 25 years. No more perfect family photos on red carpets, no more images of husband and wife standing together at political events. The large house in California was still there, but the atmosphere had changed. Big house, fewer people. The rooms that once echoed with children's voices were quieter now. The hallways that once had hurried footsteps now held only echoes of the past. Arnold still had his children. He still had family. But the wholeness was no longer the same. The family no longer gathered under one roof as a unified unit. Holidays had to be divided. Meetings had to be scheduled. Spontaneity turned into effort. He became a grandfather. The little grandchildren brought a gentler joy than any applause. When holding a grandchild in his arms, Arnold was no longer the muscle icon or the politician. He was an older man smiling at a child's laughter. There was a softness in his eyes when he spoke about his grandchildren, a peace that had rarely appeared before. But that joy didn't erase the sense of absence. The loneliness of power isn't loud. It doesn't come with drama. It comes in the evenings when work ends and the big house feels too big. It comes when he sits alone, thinking about the decisions that brought him here. Arnold was once used to always having people around, trainers, film crews, government staff, a full family. Now the private space was larger than ever. There was an irony in his life. He achieved nearly everything society views as success: fame, money, power, global influence. But no title could replace the warmth of an intact family. No award could make the house feel less empty on quiet evenings. Arnold once said he didn't believe in sitting still and regretting. He always looked forward. But loneliness forces a person to look back, not to punish himself, but to understand. He understood that the ambition that once helped him reach far could also widen distances in relationships. He understood that power brings influence, but doesn't guarantee happiness. The loneliness of greatness isn't the story of someone abandoned. Arnold still has friends, still has children who love him in their own ways, still has millions of admirers around the world. But his loneliness isn't about lacking people around him. It's about lacking the version of family that once existed. There are mornings when he still wakes up early, trains, takes care of his pets, posts motivational videos. He talks about discipline, about responsibility, about never giving up. But beneath those powerful messages, there's another layer of emotion, the awareness that success isn't a shield against loneliness. And perhaps that's why he began speaking more about gratitude, about cherishing what's left instead of regretting what's lost. He doesn't deny his mistakes, doesn't deny the consequences, but he chooses not to let them completely define the rest of his life. The loneliness of power is a price rarely talked about. When you stand at the top, not many stand with you. When you become an icon, others see the image more than the person. Arnold lived in that truth for many years, and in his 70s he learned to accept that greatness doesn't mean wholeness. In the large house, amid the memorial photos and glittering awards, Arnold Schwarzenegger is no longer the boy tensing up to keep from crying. He is a man who has gone through glory and collapse, tasted power and its consequences, and is learning to live with both. And perhaps in that stillness, he begins to understand that the hardest thing isn't conquering the world, it's living in peace with himself. And then there's the body, the thing that carried him to the top, the thing that was celebrated, admired, idolized for decades, now no longer a perfect icon, but a map of scars, surgeries, and quiet pain. Arnold Schwarzenegger once built his entire life on physical strength. But at 78, that body is no longer intact. It's held together more accurately, held upright, by willpower more than by biology. He has undergone multiple shoulder surgeries due to accumulated injuries from decades of heavy lifting and action movie stunts. The fight scenes, the falls, the impacts that weren't choreographed with modern CGI left lasting damage. Shoulder joints wore down gradually, cartilage was damaged, movements that were once smooth now produced tired grinding sounds. He broke his femur in a motorcycle accident in 2006 while serving as governor. Then came other collisions, a car accident in 2022 that flipped his vehicle at an intersection in Los Angeles. Each time, the press reminded people of the real-life action hero, but the reality was far less glamorous. Every injury was another bill due in the future. Every wound was another part of the body that had to adapt. Chronic pain became an uninvited companion, not the sharp, dramatic pain of a movie set, but the dull, persistent ache. Knees stiff in cold weather, lower back sore after a long day, shoulders that no longer rotate fully. Some mornings he needs time for his body to warm up before he can walk normally. For someone who once prided himself on physical perfection, admitting chronic pain wasn't easy. But Arnold doesn't hide it. He speaks about it as part of the price paid. Not with complaint, but with straightforwardness. At 78, he still trains almost every day. Not to win titles anymore. Not to maintain the superhuman muscle image on screen, but to keep the system running. To keep the body from collapsing faster than time allows. To keep joints functioning. To support that repaired heart with a still strong muscular system. He wakes up early, drinks coffee, drives to the gym, no longer the Gold's Gym of the 70s, but still the place where he feels he belongs. He no longer lifts the weights of his youth. He adjusts, adapts, listens to his body more than ever before. But he doesn't quit. Not to look good, but to not fall apart. That's the biggest difference between Arnold at 30 and Arnold at 78. When young, he trained to be bigger, stronger, superior to others. When old, he trains to maintain, to extend independence, to not become passive in the face of age. There is a humility in the way he trains now. No more challenging stares in the mirror, no more competing with anyone else. Just a man facing himself, trying to balance a glorious past with a fragile present. A body held together by willpower isn't a story of immortality. It's a story of persistence. His body is no longer the perfect statue sculpted by youth. It's a structure reinforced by surgery, physical therapy, and will. Many people look at Arnold and see an icon. But if you look closer, you see movements that have slowed, steps that are more careful, workouts designed to protect rather than conquer. And in that adjustment, there is another kind of strength, the strength of acceptance. He doesn't deny aging. He doesn't pretend he's still 30. He speaks plainly about limits. But he also refuses to let limits define him. Every training session is a quiet declaration. I'm still here. Perhaps that's the most admirable thing. Not the Mr. Olympia records, not the billion-dollar movies, not the governorship, but the fact that a man nearing 80, with a heart operated on multiple times, with shoulders once replaced, with silent chronic pain, still chooses to walk into the gym instead of surrendering to the sofa. His body is no longer perfect, but his will remains intact. And sometimes, at the end of a long journey, full of victories and collapses, what keeps a person standing isn't muscle, it's the decision to continue. Arnold Schwarzenegger once spent his whole life building an image, strong, indestructible, never stopping. He played emotionless machines. He walked through gunfire without blinking. He lifted weights as if gravity were negotiable. He became the icon of pure strength. But the truth is, he was never a machine. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't an absolute hero. He didn't have an intact family to the end. He was a boy who grew up in silence and harsh discipline. A young man obsessed with winning because he feared feeling not good enough. A man so successful the whole world knew his name, but still carried the voids from childhood. A husband who made serious mistakes. A father who had to learn to face the consequences. A patient lying motionless under operating room lights, dependent on a doctor's hands to live one more day. And it is precisely in those moments of weakness that he truly becomes human. Arnold went through what many Americans go through, only on a public scale. He achieved the American dream to its fullest, from an immigrant with broken English to governor of the nation's largest state, from a small gym in Austria to the pinnacle of Hollywood. He proved that opportunity in America can turn the impossible into reality. But the American dream doesn't exempt you from mistakes. It doesn't protect you from temptation. It doesn't stop you from making wrong decisions. It doesn't keep your heart healthy forever. Arnold learned that the hardest way. Fame couldn't save his marriage. Muscle couldn't prevent his heart from needing surgery. Power couldn't fix the past. And in each fall he had two choices: deny it or face it. He didn't give up. He didn't run from his mistakes. He didn't surrender to a weak heart. When the scandal broke, he didn't blame the press. He said, "This was my biggest failure." When his heart needed emergency surgery, he didn't feel sorry for himself. He recovered and kept going. When age slowed his body, he didn't pretend he was immortal. He adapted. This isn't the story of a man who never failed. It's the story of a man who didn't let failure define his entire life. There is something special in Arnold's journey. He doesn't erase the dark chapters. He carries them with him, like the scars on his chest, like the memories in the large house that is no longer whole, like the gym sessions that are no longer for glory, but for sustaining life. Greatness isn't the absence of mistakes. Greatness is getting back up after you look straight at that mistake. At 78, Arnold no longer chases titles. He speaks more about responsibility, about discipline, about helping others build better lives. He tells young people that success doesn't come from blaming others. It comes from taking full responsibility, even when it hurts. And perhaps that's his true legacy. Not Mr. Olympia, not Terminator, not governor, but a living example of rebirth. He was reborn from a poor boy into a champion athlete, reborn from a mocked actor into a cinematic icon, reborn from a controversial politician into a voice for the environment and democracy, reborn from a fallen man into a father trying to make amends, reborn from an open-heart patient into an inspiration for discipline and recovery. The American dream doesn't promise you won't fall, it only promises you have the right to stand up. Arnold fell many times, but each time he stood up in a different way, not purely with muscle anymore, but with honesty and will. Looking back, the image of the muscled man with a machine gun in hand is no longer the greatest icon. The more memorable image is an old man nearing 80, with a pacemaker under his skin, walking slowly into the gym every morning. No cameras, no script, no action call, just the decision to continue. Arnold once said he doesn't believe in luck, he believes in vision and relentless work. But at the end of this long journey, perhaps he also realized that the greatest strength isn't the ability to control everything, it's the ability to accept what you can't control. His heart isn't perfect, his life isn't perfect, his legacy isn't perfect, but it is real. And in an era where perfect images are often polished to the point of unreality, that authenticity may be the strongest thing of all. Arnold Schwarzenegger was never a machine. He is a human being with big ambitions, big mistakes, and a will bigger than both. And when he says "I'll be back today," it is no longer the threat of a robot from the future. It is the promise of an old man to himself, that even if the body slows down, even if the family is no longer as it was, even if the heart needs machines to keep beating, he will still be back, every morning, every workout, every time he faces himself, not to conquer the world, but to never give up on life. Looking back on Arnold Schwarzenegger's entire journey, people don't just see a muscle icon or a famous former governor, they see a human being who paid a very real price for every victory. The boy who grew up in the cold house in Thal, never hearing his father say "I'm proud of you," threw himself into bodybuilding, as a way to escape the feeling of not being good enough. The man who became 7-time Mr. Olympia, who said "I'll be back" in the Terminator, ultimately lay motionless under operating lights in 2018, when his congenital defective heart could barely take any more. And perhaps the most painful thing wasn't the open heart surgery, or the relearning to walk at 70, but the moment in 2011, when he had to look into Maria's eyes and his children's eyes to admit the secret that shattered their family after 25 years of marriage. When he said this was my biggest failure, it was no longer the words of a star, but the confession of a father who knew he had hurt the people he loved most. That's why Arnold's story both saddens us and earns our respect. He isn't perfect, but he doesn't hide, he doesn't blame, he accepts the consequences, rebuilds his relationship with Joseph, and still trains at 78, not to show off muscle, but to not collapse. For the American people, the lesson isn't in titles or power, but in personal responsibility. The American dream doesn't guarantee you won't make mistakes, but it gives you the chance to stand up, make amends, and live more honestly every day. If the story of this legend with a scarred heart makes you reflect, hit subscribe to the channel right now to keep joining us on these emotional journeys behind the spotlight. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we'll explore another life with wounds and resilience just as moving.